Good evening and welcome to part one of the FCWC Bronx River series. My name is Tracy Stora and I'm the program director of the Federated Conservationists of Westchester County. And I'm here with Marissa Rodriguez and Brendan McNamara from FCWC. I would like to thank Sharon Rothman from the White Plains Public Library for partnering with us on this educational series and for the use of this spectacular space. I would also like to thank Ben Brown, who awarded FCWC with a grant to produce this educational series focusing on the Bronx River. We're so excited to have Stephen Paul DeVillo, Captain Cameron Colby, and Cadet Michael Minetti with us this evening to share their in-depth knowledge of the Bronx River and the historic events that took place in the city of White Plains in Westchester County. Author and historian Stephen Paul DeVillo is an active and prominent advocate and tour guide of the Bronx River. He is well known for his Bronx River Rambles and dedication to New York City and Hudson Valley folklore. Stephen will bring his insights from many years of research on the Bronx River to discuss the history and need to conserve this beloved natural resource. Captain Cameron Colby currently serves as an instructor in the American History Division at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He leads a research project seeking to map the Revolutionary War in the Hudson Valley. This year's iteration of the project specifically looks at the 1776 New York campaign, which including the White Plains Battle. Captain Colby's presentation captures some of the current research and future plans to explore how the British invasion and American defense unfolded from August to November 1776. Cadet Michael Minetti is a senior cadet at United States Military Academy, an international history major from Maine. Cadet Minetti has been passionate about history from an early age. He's an active member of a New England-based Revolutionary War and Reenactment Society and has spent countless hours researching and educating the public about the lives of ordinary citizens who contributed and lived through the American Revolution. I'd also like you to mark your calendars for Monday, April 24th for part 2 of our Bronx River series. Evan Pritchard, who is a North American Indigenous People professor and historian, Amelia Zano, education coordinator, and Christian Murphy, ecology coordinator for the Bronx River Alliance, will be our next presenters. We will learn how the indigenous people lived and traveled on the Bronx River and other Westchester County rivers and tributaries and compare it to how we are using them today. I would also like to introduce Constance Kehoe right now, president of the Revolutionary Westchester 250. She has some events she would like to share. And thank you again for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And thanks to the library also. As Tracy said, my organization, my nonprofit, is called Revolutionary Westchester 250. So you can imagine why I'm very interested in these two talks today. We've been doing a lot through grants and funding to build awareness of all that history here, and coming together with the study of the Bronx River is so brilliant. When Tracy called me, I was really excited to be able to think about how this history focus and the environmental issues could come together, which I do believe they can. So what I just wanted to tell you about is, if you go back to the registration desk when you leave, you can take a little picture of our QR code and get our monthly newsletter. Now, we do lots of things. I hope to do a lot with West Point over these years, and certainly I know Steve and his book. But this Sunday, for example, in Briarcliff, not far from here, in the afternoon at their library, for those of you who love the story about the traitor and the spy in the American Revolution, or shall I say Benedict Arnold and Major John Andre, and the trial that happened for Major Andre, that's being portrayed by two reenactors who are excellent this Sunday. In April, I'm doing a talk through the Ferry Sloop group out of Ossining. They focus on the Hudson River, and I'm talking a lot about places in Westchester, but with a special focus on the Hudson River. So rivers, yes, absolutely important. I have business cards as well if you want to get to know us. Westchester, so much happened here. Didn't all happen in Philadelphia, didn't all happen in Boston. We got to take a claim to revolution ourselves. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you. So I'd like to start this evening with Stephen's presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. Welcome to the Bronx River. And perhaps you recognize the dude in the canoe there. Yeah, that's myself channeling an 18th century French voyageur. I started researching the history of the Bronx River when I began work at the Bronx River Alliance back in 2006. And I'm rummaging through the files. And I think, oh, gee, you know, maybe history of the Bronx River, that'd make a really nifty, like, 20 or 24-page brochure. Maybe run it off of Kinko's and hand them out free at events. Well, the project blossomed. I quickly discovered how incredibly rich the Bronx River is in both history and folklore and environmental assets as well. And things quickly ballooned into a major project. Okay, just before we get started, I'll do a really quick advertisement. Oh, that's better, yeah. If you go to the website of the Scarsdale Historical Society, there's this wonderful 45-minute video, it was made just a couple of years ago, about the history of the Bronx River. And it has an all-star cast, just about everybody who's ever been involved in the Bronx River and its restoration, including yours truly has a starring role in this production. It's totally free. Just go online, Scarsdale Historical Society, and check it out. Yeah, quick look at the Bronx River. What are we talking about? Just a few quick facts about it. As you can see, the watershed of the Bronx River is that yellow thing. It takes up a great deal of central Westchester County. And it's 23 miles long. Begins in Valhalla, and it flows all the way down to the Long Island Sound, or the East River, depending on which map you're looking at. And the blue blob at the top is the Kensico Reservoir system, where the actual original headwaters of the Bronx River remain to this day. Now, it's New York City's only freshwater river, and we brook no argument about this. This has been going back and forth over the years several times. It is freshwater all the way from Kensico down to West Farms in the Bronx. So West Farms is the neighborhood immediately south of the Bronx Zoo, almost the exact geographical center of the Bronx. And from there on down, it's a saltwater tidal estuary. So you've already got a diversity of environmental assets along the river: saltwater, freshwater, forest, marsh, everything you could ask for. Now, one of the things you find in the Bronx River is a lot of contrast in it, not just environmental contrast, but a lot of social contrast as well. You got parts of the river that you swear you're a million miles from nowhere. Beautiful sylvan woods. The picture on the right is the Garth Woods in Scarsdale. And these people walking across the bridge, they're only 30 yards away from the Bronx River Parkway. But you wouldn't know it looking at this. You'd swear you're in the Adirondacks or some such place. But it also ranges to very, very industrial urban neighborhoods, very much inner city places as you go south through the Bronx. And it flows past some of the nation's most affluent communities, such as Lawrence Park and Bronxville on the left, as well as what is the poorest urban congressional district in the nation, in the South Bronx. Now, a lot of the Bronx River's nature comes from glacial action. In the wake of the last ice ages, you had immense torrents of meltwater that deepened the existing valley, and the Botanical Garden in Bronx Zoo had carved out a whole new channel going down to Long Island Sound. The most visible remnant of this is, you probably recognize on the left, the famous balancing stone or rocking stone in the Bronx Zoo. But you also have the Bronx River Gorge on the right, which flows, this scene is flowing through the Botanical Garden, with a geologist's paradise of remains of glacial action. And I've also spotted a lot of glacial, post-glacial activity up here in White Plains as well. It's not just the Bronx portion. But enough of that, I'll go on forever about it. Now to the Native Americans, now we call it the Bronx River. Native Americans, it was known as Aquahong. Sometimes spelled with an E, that's another argument I won't get into. We're not totally sure of what Aquahong meant to the Lenni Lenape people who inhabited the valley. Most common translation is something like the River Five Bluffs, but there's several competing translations as well. And there are a number of Native American settlements along the Bronx River. Quinnahong, for example, that's generally translated as the planting neck. We know it as Hunts Point. Or Snaggapins across the river Castle Hill in the Bronx means something roughly like the land between the two waters. And further up the Bronx, along Gun Hill Road, was a small settlement known as Conangun, and which I think is the actual origin of the place named Gun Hill, but we could discuss that later. And right where we're sitting tonight is Quaropus, generally translated as the White Marsh. The Europeans took it to mean White Plains. There are several others too that I believe existed one time or another, but those are the four settlements that we can confidently document. Now, so how did it become the Bronx River? Well, it was during the days of New Amsterdam, I was a Swedish sea captain, purchased a tract of land in what today is Mott Haven in the South Bronx. They purchased it from the native Lenni Lenape, and he settled down there. He brought in a lot of tenant farmers, mostly Irish and Germans, to farm the land and grow tobacco. So already, the Bronx, there's always this ethnic diversity that runs through the history of the Bronx. Only a handful of these people were Dutch at all, even though they were living under the Dutch government. And he wasn't there for long. He died in 1643, but before he died, he was able to negotiate a peace with the local Native Americans that kept a brewing war from engulfing his estate. And we remember him today. His family crest is on the flag of the borough of the Bronx, along with his motto, Nisi Malice, yield not to evil. And we've been trying to do that ever since. So Bronx's settlement was abandoned, 1643. The next wave of European settlers came in to the Bronx River about 1666. They came from a previously established settlement, what today we know as Westchester Square. Then it was Westchester Town. And a bunch of them moved across the river in 1664, negotiated another land purchase, and they carved it up into a series of farms. And what do we call it? We've got Westchester, we've got Eastchester, we've got Chesters all over the place. Well, let's just call it the West Farms. And the neighborhood to this day, one of the most intensely urbanized inner city neighborhoods in the Bronx. And people, look at me funny, like, well, dude, where's the farm? That's an example of how things persist in place names. But there were Connecticut Yankees coming in from Connecticut, and the first thing they did, what drew them to West Farms in the first place, was the fall of the river, which made places where you could erect dams and water-powered mill wheels. Example in the picture is one from New Jersey, circa 1930s, but it illustrates the type of mill that these Connecticut settlers would have put up. And by the way, the fellow in the picture on the left, that's a statue of the Reverend Thomas Hooker. And he is the ancestor of White Plains' own Abigail Smith Purdy. In case you're wondering where she came from. Now, from 1674 onward, the Bronx River was increasingly used as an industrial river. And there's remnants of this all up and down the river if you're looking for them. Probably the most familiar to Westchester people would be the old cotton mill, when today's Tuckahoe, put up in 1808. Is one of only two existing early mills along the river. And you're probably familiar with this place. So it used to be the Welcome Pharmaceutical Company, just directly across the river from the from the cotton mill. Today it's a senior living residence, but they made a lot of pharmaceutical history there, which I will not get into. And just half a mile to the east of the cotton mill at the Welcome campus, you had a whole another industry of quarrying marble. Tuckahoe marble, which went into a list of buildings that would take an hour to recite. But among them, the Washington Monument, City Hall, St. Patrick's Cathedral, the list goes on and on. And this flourished there for almost a century. The traces of the quarries are still visible, along with a nice little monument they got put up there. There's other remnants too. If you're walking up the pathway through Bronxville, the spot on the left is the Swain Mill. Today it's part of the foundation of an apartment complex, but if you look down below you can see some of the original stonework. And on the right you've got the remnants of the hobbled gunpowder mill, the little bridge that takes the Bronx River path right across what used to be the mill race. Now, there's no other trace of the gunpowder factory, and you can imagine why. Kaboom. And we also had some very unique industries along the Bronx River, too. Now, on the left in the Botanical Garden is the building that was the Lorillard Snuff Mill. Today, that's not the name, they call it the stone mill. And it's a wonderful place to have wedding receptions and things like that. But back in the day, this was an innovative technique in the 1840s for producing massive quantities of snuff using millstones. And if you wonder what snuff is, basically it's very finely powdered tobacco mixed with very finely powdered dried rose petals. And there's no nice way of putting this. You snort it up your nose and get a little hit of nicotine. Keep you going for a few more minutes. But on the right, and this is very easily overlooked, it's a very, very deeply vandalized and ruined monument. It was one of these Greek exedras, these semicircular seating places. But it marked the spot where in the 1890s, early 1900s, there flourished a factory for producing, believe it or not, reproduction medieval French tapestries, using all the old medieval techniques. And the funny thing is that the reason they located there, just a few yards south of Gun Hill Road in the Bronx, it was the quality of the Bronx River's water. And we usually don't associate quality with Bronx River water, but at the time it chemically matched the stream that flowed past the famous Gobelin factory in Paris. As the Gobelins produced these wonderful, vivid hues and colors. And the idea was that they could use water to make the dye stuff, so if it matched what was used in Paris, they too could produce vivid colors, and they did. It was a lot of these tapestries still exist today. It's some in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now we'll touch on this subject in a little bit more depth later on, but as you got into the 1770s, the Bronx River became a river of conflict, a strategic waterway, if you will. And the big episode was the Battle of White Plains that took place really within a short walk of where we're standing in October 1776. The Bronx River played a very key role in shaping the course of this battle, both by channeling the British strategy and also in not foiling, but slowing down a British Hessian attack on part of the American lines. It turned what could have been a decisive victory into a very inconclusive affray. But we'll speak more of that later on. But that wasn't the end of the trouble of the Bronx River and the Revolution. For the remainder of the war, just about all the Bronx River Valley between White Plains and Long Island Sound was called the neutral ground. It was controlled by neither side or army, and all kinds of mayhem went on. It was not a healthy place to be during the war. Now the fellow on the left is a guy by the name of James Delancey, a very wealthy colonial family. His family estate is almost exactly the footprint of today's Bronx Zoo. And he turned his family estate into a stronghold for loyalists, fleeing from upstate where the Patriots were burning out their farms. And he organized them into a militia that he sent on raids up and down the Bronx River Valley. And they became known as the Cowboys. Now, cowboy at this time, this was the first use of the term. It was not a complimentary term at all. It meant that these were guys that made a specialty of stealing people's cattle and running them down and selling them to the British Army. Up until the 20th century, forget what you saw in the late night movies, the old westerns. Up until the 20th century, if you called somebody a cowboy, it was a good way to get yourself shot. It was an insult, right until the first Western movies came out. And I'll give you a bit more of that a little later. Their supposedly patriot counterparts to the cowboys were the Skinners. And they went around raiding loyalist homesteads. And their specialty, what they really loved to do was trash the buildings they invaded. They'd steal everything in sight, they'd bust up the furniture, and then just for a finishing touch, just to let you know it was them, they'd peel the wallpaper off the walls, they'd skin the walls. And this is what gave them the name Skinners. And alongside all that, you had spies and secret agents. The picture on the right is a monument at the Scarsdale Library, and it depicts a fictional character by the name of Harvey Birch. And he was the protagonist in one of the very first American bestsellers, James Fenimore Cooper's The Spy. And he may or may not have been based on a man who's buried in Yorktown by the name of Enoch Crosby. That's a whole other controversy. After the Revolution, things calmed down a bit. The Bronx River had another existence, this time as a river of literature. We had poets and writers and authors that were drawing inspiration from the Bronx River. I already mentioned James Cooper. He settled in Scarsdale in 1818. His farm is where today the Fenway Golf Course is, if you're looking for it. And he picked up stories of some of the mayhem and tales that went on along the Bronx River, and he wove them into this first American best-selling novel, The Spy. And it's still worth reading today if you want to pick up a copy somewhere. The guy in the middle is today a bit more obscure, though. Perhaps if you're of a certain age, you might remember in grammar school you had to memorize and recite the poem Our Flag. Well, nobody does. I guess I'm getting old. But, well, anyway, Joseph Rodman Drake is the guy who wrote it. But his better claim to fame is that he wrote a very beautiful elegiac poem in honor of the Bronx River. I'll see your face again, my own romantic Bronx, is one of the lines. I won't recite the whole thing. But he loved the Bronx River. He would come up to the Bronx River every chance he got, because he was suffering from tuberculosis. And he spent his weekends along the Bronx River trying to get some fresh air and relief, from the disease that would kill him at the age of 20. But his dying wish was to be buried along the banks of his beloved Bronx River. And he's there to this day in Hunts Point. There's a little cemetery amidst all the factories in which Joseph Rodman Drake is buried. And I guess the fellow on the right really doesn't need much of an introduction. He's sort of a neighbor of mine, Edgar Allan Poe. And he spent the last 3 years of his life along the Bronx River. He had a little cottage in what was then known as Fordham Manor. The cottage is still there, and you can visit it today. And he would go down, one of the things, he was a champion walker. He liked to take really, really long walks, thinking deep thoughts and, gathering inspiration. And one of his favorite walks was down along the Bronx River, going through what today is the Botanical Garden. And we can't totally prove this, but we're pretty sure that at least 2 of his stories, he took inspiration of the landscape, and descriptions of the landscape were woven into these stories. If you want to look them up, it's the Domain of Arnhem and Landor's Cottage. Not his best known works, but worth looking up if you get a chance. And the river also drew, graphic artists as well, not just poets and writers. A number of Hudson River School painters came over to the Bronx River. I guess after a while they got tired of the Hudson River. They looked for something a little more manageable, and the Bronx River suited the bill. It's one of my favorites, the one by Sanford Gifford, On the Bronx River. And I'm 90% positive I can identify this location. It's in what today is the Bronx River Forest, just immediately north of the Botanical Garden. But it wasn't just all in the past. Even today, this still continues to inspire videographers, painters, other artistic types of people. And the picture on the right is by Xavier Figueroa, Aquahung. This was a temporary sculpture installation that was put in at West Farms, just right on West Farms Plaza next to the 2 and the 5 train station, if you're familiar with the neighborhood. And it references the 182nd Street Dam, which sometimes called the Zoo Dam, as you approach the Bronx Zoo. And with all the various critters, making their way up and down the waterfall. I'm very proud of this. It's a temporary installation. It's long gone, but at the time I was working as a grant writer for the Bronx River Art Center, and I wrote the grant that got this thing funded. Now this is something really interesting. This really only developed as I was researching the book. The possibility, and I'm like 99% sure of this now, that the Bronx River Valley was a subsidiary route on the Underground Railroad. Researching the folklore, I came across the story, the picture on the left, a little spot there by the Church of St. James the Less in Scarsdale. Absolutely beautiful place to visit if you get a chance to go that way. There's this little plot with the stones that were said to be the burial of fugitives who died in transit, making their way along the Underground Railroad. Now, frankly, I was rather skeptical of this, but of course I had to go out there and seek it out and take a picture. But since then, putting pieces together, 2 and 2, I'm convinced that the Bronx River did serve as a route for the Underground Railroad. You have a number of proven, documented Underground Railroad operatives up and down the valley, and including Scarsdale, which was an old Quaker community, very anti-slavery, with easy connections to other operatives north and east of the place. So that's as much as I can tell you. None of these stones have a name on them. So we don't know who the names of these people or anything about them. But nevertheless, they're there, and you can park your car there and just check it out anytime. It's one of the most peaceful places in Westchester County. I was just there last Sunday for a concert. I really loved the place. Now, while fugitives were making their way up the Bronx River, at the same time it started in what today is Westchester County, started to develop into the Westchester County as we know it, the very suburban, elegant county. As it began in the 1850s, the very first one was, believe it or not, Mount Vernon, which started as a suburban development for skilled workers from New York City who were fleeing, high rents, and that sounds familiar. Well, they were fleeing high rents in the city, and they set up this community just over the border, today's border, in Mount Vernon. Within a couple of years, the next major suburban development would be set up just abutting Mount Vernon, just the north of Mount Vernon, Fleetwood. And this was totally different from the proletarian nature of Mount Vernon. This was like what we think of as a really grand suburb with these small, country estates and grand houses. And the postcard there on the left is, that's the estate of James Bailey, the circus entrepreneur who teamed up with Barnum to create the greatest show on earth. The building's not there anymore, but this gives you an example of what Fleetwood looked like in its day. And perhaps the quintessential Westchester suburb is Bronxville. That's a weird collection of pictures, isn't it? But, well, there's method in my madness, folks. Bronxville has a very curious history. It was founded by a fellow by the name of William Van Duzer Lawrence. Lawrence, that sounds familiar somewhere. Does it ring a bell? Well, he was a guy, he was into pharmaceuticals. And he made a fortune selling this concoction, Perry Davis's vegetable painkiller. I have no idea if this stuff worked at all, but it was immensely popular. People bought it like crazy. It was like the Advil of the 19th century. So he made his fortune, decided it's time to settle down. He would build his own retirement community, so to speak. Very, very exclusive and select development there in Bronxville. And today it's the only remaining community that is named for the river. The Bronx as a borough did not exist at this time. And within this exclusive community, carved out an even more exclusive enclave. Today is known as Lawrence Park. Yeah, that name again, keep running into it. Probably familiar with Sarah Lawrence University, Lawrence Hospital, Lawrence all over the place. So which brings us to, what does all this have to do with General Custer? Well, he's creating this exclusive mini enclave, and he wanted to devote it as a colony of artists and writers, and albeit, very, very successful artists and writers. So then as now, if you want to develop a place like this, you need a celebrity client, get a celebrity to settle in, and the celebrity he got was Elizabeth Custer. She's there in the picture with her husband and her brother-in-law, Tom. Elizabeth Custer, who spent a 50-year-long widowhood defending her husband's reputation, and in the process wrote a couple of best-selling books, so she had the kind of money that would get her into Lawrence Park. Her house was on the market just a couple of years ago. It fetched somewhere upward of $5 million, still standing. But anyway, that's her with George and Tom, and it's kind of a creepy picture because about a few weeks after this photo was taken, both those men were dead at Little Bighorn. That's another story. Why you had the big, grand suburbs going up in Westchester, downstream in what would become the Bronx, you had more urban communities growing up, including one or two really unique ones like the bungalow neighborhood of Harding Park, which is almost right at the mouth of the Bronx River. It's pictured on the left. But you had more conventional, brownstone urban places like Longwood on the right. And the quote there, if you remember the movie The Jazz Singer, Al Jolson, I forget his character's name in the movie, but Al Jolson makes his first fistful of money and he rushes home to Mom and, "Mama, we're moving to the Bronx." Well, it sounds like a very funny thing to say, but at this time, in the early 1920s, for a lot of people, moving up to the Bronx was a step ahead in the world, moving in places like Longwood or Hunts Point. Sometimes when I'm doing walking tours, I challenge people for doing a tour of Hunts Point. I challenge them to, as we go along, keep a tally of how many old former synagogues you can spot along the street. It was once Hunts Point was a very Jewish neighborhood. People moving up from Cherry Street, Hester Street, and believe me, if you come from Cherry Street or Hester Street at the time, Hunts Point was a step ahead. Now, another curious chapter in the Bronx River's history was its role as a home of French restaurants and beer gardens. Now, in 1870, when a guy named Laguerre came to what today is Williamsbridge in the North Bronx and set up a riverside resort, French cuisine was not available to most Americans. If you were wealthy and you could afford your own French chef, fine, or if you could afford to go to a place like Delmonico's, that was cool, but most people could not access French cuisine. It was almost unknown in the country. Laguerre set up this resort, and anybody could manage the train fare up to Williamsburg was welcome to come. You had a nice riverside arbor, and you could sit out there beneath the grapevines. You could even row your boat. You could tie a boat up there and spend an afternoon. And the cuisine was the real thing, real French country cuisine with a cast of real French characters too, which I won't get into, but quite an interesting place. And it drew the attention of celebrities at the time, noted writers, such as the guy on the left, Francis Hopkinson Smith. And he's pretty much forgotten today, but he was hot stuff at the time. Yes, he's looking very full of himself there, and trust me, he was. He was a descendant of Francis Hopkinson, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he made sure you knew it if you didn't know it already. But what he did, he wrote an elegiac account of Laguerre's place, the Hermitage, that is titled A Day at Laguerre's. And this became very popular. It was reprinted all over the country in various magazines. And Laguerre's gained a nationwide fame. He was soon joined by another one, French Charlie's, which is given its name to various places in the neighborhood I live in now, with all kinds of different interpretations where the name came from. But it too was a riverside French restaurant resort. And I've recently located the site. Anybody wants to go thrashing through the weeds with me, I'll come show you sometime. But also while the French were flourishing, and she mentioned Laguerre's drew not just Francis Hopkins and Smith, but the guy on the right, Mark Twain. And we think of him with the Mississippi, but he too would like a more manageable river from time to time. And he lived for several years in New York, so he too would take the train up from Grand Central to Williamsburg and spend the day at Laguerre's, along with Bret Harte and a few other noted writers. While this was going on, he had a lot of Germans were moving in to Wakefield in the North Bronx. Olinville, village of Olinville, was very much a French-speaking community at the time. They staffed these French restaurants as well as lace factories, and there's a whole story there too. As the Germans were moving in, of course, Germans wanted to have beer gardens, so they moved in and set up some, such as Bellevue Park, and my favorite, Volker's Schützenpark, which, believe it or not, was a place that combined a rifle range with a beer garden. And this kind of thing makes me really nervous. I'm looking for the location of it, because I'm convinced that when I find it, there's going to be a major leaded contamination in the soil, but I haven't found it yet. But all these things took place within a quarter-mile reach of the Bronx River, between Gun Hill Road and Burke Avenue in today's Bronx. And all go on today. 1888, the city's looking forward, and this became the first initiative to preserve the Bronx River, when the city acquired a massive amount of land along the river as Bronx Park, which was quickly parceled out to organizations such as the New York Botanical Garden, 1895, and then quickly followed by the Bronx Zoo in 1899. And the Bronx River now is becoming a leisure destination for restaurants, beer gardens, zoos, botanical gardens, and further downstream, all kinds of tourist attractions. The zoo at this time actually promoted the Bronx River as a scenic asset. And its place you had on the left there, the top left, was the Bronx River Gorge as it goes through the Bronx Zoo. And there were walking paths at either side of the river, and it was a place scenic enough that, well, you could see it was worth writing home about, buy a postcard and tell everybody who was there. A little further down, they actually had a boathouse and a restaurant, right behind what today we call the 182nd Street Dam, where you could have a nice little lunch or dinner, and then you take your sweetheart out in a rowboat, and then, frighten her to death, row right up to the edge of the dam, and then they'd have to tow you back with a motor launch. Somehow nobody got killed all the years this boathouse was in operation, but every weekend, at least one guy would go right to the edge of the dam and get stuck and create a panic. No trace of it today. Where that building is, it's now the footprint is the powerhouse for the Bronx Zoo monorail that takes you over to Wild Asia. But a little further downstream, we actually had a Bronx River fishing fleet, just right below Westchester Avenue, which flourished from the 1930s right up until the end of 1989. It ended rather tragically, but that's another story. But it was a place that was up to 3 charter fishing boats. You could buy a ticket and go out for some serious saltwater fishing. And all the way down at the bottom, on the left-hand side, that looks like Luna Park in Coney Island, right? Well, that's what they wanted you to think. That's actually a postcard of Clausen's Point Park, the very, very end of the Bronx River, right opposite Hunts Point. And that little peninsula would eventually be the home to 3 amusement parks, all gone under, sad circumstances. But the grandest one of them all was just about a mile upstream, was Starlight Park. And I could talk for 2 hours about this place. It has a fabulous, complicated history, but it was mostly noted for an immense saltwater swimming pool. And where did the saltwater come from? Well, you guessed it. Yes, the Bronx River, and filtered it through sand. There was no chlorination as far as I know. So that's why the young lady on the left is pausing, like, if I dive in, am I going to catch something or what? Starlight Park happened to be there because of another very, very obscure aspect of Bronx River's history, was 3 attempts to have a World's Fair on the Bronx River. Starlight Park was the third, but it failed and it morphed into an amusement park. But prior to that, the fellow on the right, General Egbert Ludovicius Villa, yeah, they don't make names like that anymore. Champion engineer, he drew up the first plans for Central Park. He drew a hydrological map of Manhattan Island that is still referenced today. At the end of the 1880s, he's down at Hunts Point with the task of developing the peninsula as an industrial zone. And he comes up with the idea that if we get them to have a World's Fair down here, at the bottom of the Hunts Point Peninsula, come in and put in roadways, sewers, utilities, all on the World's Fair's dime. And then when they pull up the World's Fair, we're ready to move in, put in industry and factories. A guy by the name of Robert Moses would pick up on this idea years later to develop Flushing Meadows Park. But it didn't work for General Villa. I had put in a bid for the 1889 International Exposition while it went to Paris, and we missed out on the Statue of Liberty. Tried again in 1892 for the Columbian Exposition, and that went famously to Chicago and the White City and all that. So some things just don't work out. But one thing that did work out for quite a while, and again, this is another very obscure chapter of the Bronx River's history, is it's a locale for silent movies. Now, believe it or not, at the beginning of the 20th century, the film industry was centered here in New York City, not in Hollywood. Hollywood nobody had heard of at this time. And there were no less than 4 film studios in and around the Bronx River. You had Edison, you had Griffiths, you had Tannhauser up in New Rochelle, you had Pat Powers up in the North Bronx, and they all used Bronx Park and the Bronx River for outdoor shoots. Young lady there on the left in the cigar curls is a girl by the name of Mignon Anderson. She made several, short 2-reelers along the Bronx River. Very lovely, very, very petite young woman. She had the inevitable nickname at the studio of, you guessed it, filet mignon. But she's a lot tougher than she looked, because back in those days there was no stunt doubles. You had to do your own stunts or seek employment elsewhere. And Mignon would do things like jumping fully clothed into the Bronx River to rescue her sweetheart and other feats of daring do. Woman in the middle with the pig, that's her pet, by the way, go figure. But that's a woman by the name of Pearl White. Yeah, she should have been a dentist with that name, but she was a film actress. And she made films along the Bronx River for Pat Powers' studio in the North Bronx. The studio burned down. Pearl White moved out to Fort Lee, New Jersey, and continued making movies along the Palisades. Movies that became known as cliffhangers. Yes, she was the first cliffhanger. Now, the guy on the right, now, I've been talking about, remember Delancey and his cowboys? Cowboy was a curse word. This guy, William S. Hart, is the guy who turned cowboys into the white hats. And through a number of early movies, such as Hell's Hinges and quite a few others. The interesting thing is he grew up in West Farms, and he spent his boyhood playing and swimming in the Bronx River, the exact spot where Delancey led his cowboys out on their forays during the Revolutionary War. And this one, I'm still working on this. They sank the Titanic in the Bronx. It was 6 weeks after the disaster, a film of the Titanic was made, using a simulacrum of the side of the ship that would collapse, and people were jumping off and screaming in the middle of the night. I'm trying to identify the movie. I'm almost certain it was a movie made 6 weeks after the disaster, starring young woman Dorothy Gibson, who was herself a Titanic survivor. Nobody heard of PTSD in those days. I'm just not certain. It was either that or it might have been a fake newsreel. There are a number of companies that make fake newsreels. See the actual footage of the Titanic sinking. The file is still open on this one. So what happened to the Bronx River? Well, as you got to about 1900, it reached a tipping point. Had all these communities growing up along the Bronx River, and they all sent their sewerage just right straight into the river. Out of sight, out of mind, that works all the time. These pictures kind of give you an idea of what the river was looking like in many places. especially the one on the right. That's my favorite, because take a look at that and see where all the outhouses are located. And you see why the river got to the point where by 1905 they were having waterfowl in the Bronx Zoo were dying of unknown diseases. And well, the Bronx Zoo had some very influential people on its board of directors. This is the New York Zoological Society. And they knew who to talk to, they knew who to contact up in Albany, and they came up with an idea: we've got to do something to save the Bronx River, or we're going to lose the Bronx Zoo. And the idea they came up with was the Bronx River Parkway. Believe it or not, the Bronx River Parkway was intended as an initiative to save the Bronx River. It was not planned as a commuter route. It really went from nowhere to nowhere. It was Kensico Dam down to the north end of the Botanical Garden. Strictly a leisure drive. But the leisure drive is what sold the whole idea of the Bronx River Parkway Reservation. First, they would channel all the sewerage into pipes that would run underneath and alongside the residences and factories between 300 and 1,000 feet away from the river. And this involved a lot of, as you may imagine, eminent domain. A lot of communities were broken up. I could point out the sites of some of them as we walk up and down the river. People who could afford it would jack their house up, put it on rollers, and have a 20-mule team haul it off the reservation, quite literally. Well, the parkway and the reservation did solve some of the pollution, but south of the zoo, the river was still an industrial stream. West Farms itself had long been a textile processing center, had a lot of other factories from there on down to the Long Island Sound. As things started to die out in the 40s and 50s, conditions on this reach of the river started reaching their nadir. This is an example of the dumping that was happening in the river. This is just a 3-minute walk from where Starlight Park had been. It's not the worst example by any means. I can testify there were parts of the river that if you look down from the subway crossing over, you couldn't see the water anymore. It was all full of refrigerators, washing machines, and, well, things I won't even mention, but it was pretty bad. So just when things get darkest, things start to turn around, as they often do in history. 1974, exactly, or close to exactly 300 years after the first mills were built on the Bronx River, in the exact same location of West Farms, the woman on the left, Ruth Anderberg, got together a citizen action group. It's her picture taken of her. I had the honor of interviewing her for StoryCorps a few years ago. She passed away since then. But she got a group of people together and started just bare knuckle work of taking trash out of the Bronx River at West Farms. And it's a wonderful long story. I won't get into it, but you notice the logo that her organization, Bronx River Restoration, came up with, in the very 70s kind of artwork, but it references the mills that once rose on the Bronx River. And what often happens once you get the ball rolling, other citizen groups started coming together in the late 70s, early 80s. Among them, I'll just point out one of them because there's a list of about 50. Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice. They pointed to an abandoned concrete plant along the river with a proposal this be turned into a park for a community that was very, very sorely lacking in parks. Well, the city wanted to run a truck route through the spot, and they had 101 reasons how it couldn't be done, and they'd have public meetings, and they'd bring in the experts, the experts would be, no, it can't be done, too expensive, too impractical, Well, anyway, that's a young woman by the name of Alexia Torres Fleming. She was the head of the Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, and she's there at one of these interminable meetings with the sign, "We live here, we're experts too." And her efforts succeeded eventually. We'll see in a very short while. Parks Department finally started to take notice of all these flourishing citizen action groups. And in 1999, they brought them together in what was known as the Bronx River Working Group, a coalition of all these different organizations. The lady in green there, Jenny Hoffner, was the first head of the Bronx River Working Group. Pictured there at a conference in Baltimore, River Conference. about 10, 12 years ago. And I don't know who the guy is next door. Some guy wandered in off the docks. Who knows? But it started to succeed, and eventually the working group was morphed into a standalone not-for-profit known as the Bronx River Alliance, followed closely by the Bronx River Parkway Reservation Conservancy, which is the Alliance's counterpart in Westchester. And among the early successes, they started to bring back some of the native animals. My friend Millie there is holding up, that is a alewife herring, or river herring as it's more politely known nowadays. A migratory fish that had been absent from the Bronx River for just about 300 years. And they've returned, and they're continuing to return since then. And we also had beaver. Beaver came back after an absence of 200 years, and they've since departed, but no doubt there'll be more coming in the near future. So just to wrap things up, just give you an idea of some of what's been happening on the Bronx River. A number of new parks have gone up, sometimes very award-winning parks, like Hunts Point Riverside Park, which too began as a citizen action bare-knuckle cleanup effort. Parks Department took notice, and they morphed it into literally an award-winning design of a park. Beautiful place, less than 2 acres in extent, which is worth a visit. Complete with concrete rivercraft for kids to play with. By the way, that concrete rowboat, it floats. No, I'm serious. I'm not making this up. When the storm surge from Hurricane Sandy came through, it lifted that boat and moved it about 30 yards inland.
Oh, wow.
I saw it. I couldn't believe it. Isn't that supposed to be over there? No, not anymore. There's the concrete plant park I mentioned. This is what they made of the abandoned concrete plant. Beautiful riverside esplanade, and they preserved some of the old silos as tokens of the river's history. And Starlight Park, where the abandoned amusement park once been, has also been refurbished. It's a wonderful place with playing fields, a nice little pedestrian bridge. And it's about to double in size. They've extended it into some new lands that have never been parklands before, which will give a very easy connection to a concrete plant park downstream. It's about to open, I'm told. Hopefully it will, because on the 22nd of April, I'm supposed to be leading a walk, like an inaugural walk with the brass band and all, to celebrate the opening. And another initiative has been to modify the river so the migratory fish and eels can make their journeys. Like the alewife, which lives in salt water but has to come back to fresh water. And it has to be the same fresh water it was spawned in, not just any old fresh water. The American river eel does the exact opposite. Lives in fresh water, then it goes down to the Sargasso Sea to spawn, all the way down east of Florida. And it's a one-way trip. It's a suicide trip for them. They spawn, and the little guys, the elvers, maybe about 2 inches long. And don't ask me how they do this, but somehow they make their way up from the Sargasso Sea back to fresh water. And again, for them, it can't be any old fresh water. It has to be the very body of water mommy and dad came from. But the fish ladder sounds like a ridiculous term. It's a series of graduated steps that'll lead you up or down past this 15-foot dam. This is the 182nd Street Dam. And they've been using it because there's a camera up on top that records them as they go by. And the numbers have been increasing year by year. So we end up with a question that's impossible to answer: is it restoration or revitalization? Can we restore the river? Restore it to what? 1609, 1809, even 1909. That's the picture on the left. Really, it just can't be done. But we can revitalize it as an educational and environmental resource for everybody. So I want to thank everybody, and we'll probably have some questions afterwards.
So much. That was so fascinating, and I can't wait to explore some of these places. But I'd like to introduce Captain Colby now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephen. This is a great foundation for us to build on. So again, I'm Cameron Colby. I'm a captain in the history department up at West Point. I have with me Cadet Michael Minetti. He's also a history major, first class senior cadet, so he's come a long way at West Point, and he's going to help me present here in this discussion, because if you know anything about West Point is a very Socratic method institution. I won't ask you any difficult questions, but I will give you some maps to engage with that you can kind of look at some maps while we're talking. So if, Cadet Minetti, if you could grab our first map I want to share with everybody, is actually this map is done in the 1800s, part of these many revitalization efforts that go on in Westchester County and New York City. And this map is actually depicting the prior to the Revolution. So this is the when New York and Westchester County is obviously a British colony and British holding. This map is representing the manors along Westchester County, and specifically the Bronx River is right in the middle of this. So Cadet Minetti, if you would be willing to take it over here and take a look at it, pass it around the rows, and this map can go all the way around. Feel free to look at it as long as you want, or short as you want, and pass it along. So the beautiful long history of the Bronx River that Stephen gave us has built up the world. We built all the way up to the early 1900s, where we saw these amusement parks and movie theaters. So this map is taking us way back to plantations and farms, and not a lot here. These are very small homesteads and farms, and the Bronx River is going to be one of those primary routes in the middle of Westchester County. Cadet Minetti, if you just hold these maps up quickly, I'll pass them around when we come to it more in our discussion. But the one he has here is a much smaller one, but the next iteration of this map, this is after the Revolution, the manors and boroughs might have been broken up and sold to many different families. And you'll recognize some of the names on this map more specifically of how they've changed from the manors to owned properties, large plantations. You can put that one down for now. And the next two I have are actually the same map. One is more of a manuscript drawn here during the campaign of 1776, and this is done by a British engineer named Claude Joseph Sauthier. And he drew this map, and this was handed off to the Howe brothers, General Howe and Admiral Howe, as they planned out the rest of the revolutionary campaign that they fought here. So this manuscript map was 1776, and the next one is actually the 1777 version, redrawn by William Faden and published in London. So this one is a little bit cleaner, or have it upside down, a little bit cleaner, but it's the same map, and this is published in London, so everyone in England is following along what's going on here in the Revolution. And this map, this exact copy is actually owned by West Point. We have one of the original editions of West Point that's fantastic to look at the history that's on here, and you'll see White Plains very clearly on this map as it comes around. So these maps are all really powerful tools of history to see why this region is so important. To set the stage for what's going on in the Revolution. As was mentioned, the 250th anniversary is coming up, and I 100% agree that New York and Westchester County has a huge history of the Revolution that needs to be clung to, and Mr. DeVillo has literally written the book on White Plains that actually helps set that up a little bit. So there's a lot of great things going on. So I do want to move quickly. I know we're running, it's getting a little late. I don't want to fall asleep on you here. But the Bronx River, I want to highlight, is a inner passage. It's an inner passage of Westchester County, because we have the west is the Hudson River, which is a big river. Almost any boat can move up and down the Hudson, especially back in colonial times. There is no boat that can't traverse the Hudson at this point. Also, we have the whole Long Island Sound, and the East River is another large body of water that is to the east and wrapping around to New York City, obviously. And the Bronx becomes this little inner passage right up this peninsula of Westchester County. And George Washington is going to love that for a lot of reasons, 1776. Before I get into the actual campaign, I want to pass it off to Cadet Minetti, and he has some great history of kind of, as Westchester County is loyalists and patriots. It's a very contested, there's multiple personalities going on in Westchester County.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I'll set the stage for what's happening in 1776, the big battle, for you a little bit. So going all the way back to the 1660s, as Sir said, the British show up, and at the time New York is a Dutch colony, and they sail into New York City. In the future, actually, the future King James II goes up into New York City. He's the Duke of York at the time, and he says, "You guys are going to be British now." And the Dutch very reluctantly say, "Okay, yes, we'll be British now." And so a lot of those estates that were previously Dutch are turned over to the English, the largest of which goes to the Phillips family, which we now know Phillipsburg Manor, a lot of things named after the Phillips family. It becomes a very large part of Westchester County, but it's very important to note that the boundary, it's bounded on one side by the Hudson River, on the other side it's bounded by the Bronx River. That's where the map makers draw that line. And so sort of getting into the Revolutionary era in the 1700s, by this time you have English settlers, Dutch settlers, German settlers, sir, as you highlighted. Very diverse population growing up, so it's not these firebrand Puritans from New England or the firebrands in Philadelphia. You actually get a much more mixed population in New York, especially in the years leading up to the Revolution, because the Bostonians are chasing all their loyalists out of Boston, and these are largely merchants. And so where do they go? They go to the next biggest port down the Atlantic coast, which is New York. And so prior to the Revolution, you actually get a decent influx of immigrant or refugees from Boston, loyalist refugees, who are setting up shop in New York City. And what that does is it sets up a very interesting dynamic in the city and further up into Westchester County as well, where on the one hand, after the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts are passed in 1773, you get tea parties, tea burnings all through Westchester County where patriots are burning tea, but at the same time you have the loyalist neighbors not necessarily supporting the coercive acts per se, but not opposing them either. And so on the eve of the Revolution, Westchester County is very much divided, where you have Englishmen, typically more wealthy English people, supporting the crown because they see their interests as being tied to the crown. Some of the middle class, lower class folks supporting the revolution because that's where they see their best chances for upward mobility coming from. And then you have these other populations, the Germans and the Dutch, who unless they've married into English families, they really sort of see this as an English conflict, which they would really rather just stay out of. And so that will, going into the early battles of the Revolution, that influences to recruiting efforts throughout Westchester County, where you'll see recruitment on both sides, so loyalist units being recruited as well as American units. And that brings us to the New York campaign of 1776. Sir?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. One really fascinating story I do want to highlight this specifically in Westchester County is many of you may have heard of the journal of Joseph Plum Martin. Joseph Plum Martin is one of the most famous young revolutionaries that ended up writing down his memoirs of it. And when he's in Westchester County during this whole campaign, there's one point where his unit is starving. They're running out of food, so they start going to the loyalists in the area and saying, we need food at this time. And there's actually an older woman who he goes to her house continually, and she provides him milk. She gives him milk, and he brings his milk back to his squad mates, and they're like, we don't want loyalist milk. She's going to poison it or something. He's like, no. She's been great to me. She's given me milk. But she had a caveat. Every time she gave him milk, she lectured him on why he should not be rebelling against the king, because she was a loyalist and said, don't fight against the king, you're going to die in this war, don't do this. And he got tired of her lecturing, and he began waiting in the barn. He said, I don't want your lecture, but I still want your milk. And then her slave actually began lecturing him as well, who's a black man, and he came to Joseph Plum Martin, and he said the same thing. Why are you rebelling against the great prince of Britain? Britain will crush you all. And that enslaved man ended up running and joining Howe's forces actually during this campaign, which is a really amazing thing that came out of from Phillips Manor. They were actually tenants on Phillips Manor during this campaign. But New York campaign of 1776. 1776 is the year. We all know 1776, the Declaration is signed. That's summer of 76. This New York campaign is August. So right after July 4th, the first major campaign is the invasion of New York. And the invasion of New York is George Washington's chance to prove that he's a continental general, that he's going to say, I can bring together these disparate and grumpy colonists, and we're going to get together and we're going to stop the greatest empire on earth through our own means. But before we get to 76, Washington had actually already learned a lot of lessons in 75. The Revolutionary War is beginning in 75, which is something we often forget about, but we do know the famous Battle of Bunker Hill, Lexington, Concord. Other events did happen in 75, and in 75, the siege of Boston is really important to George Washington's overall strategy that he's going to get to for 76. And his counterpart general, British General Howe, also learned a lot during that Boston campaign. Specifically, there's another fascinating primary source that says General Howe followed the troops up Bunker Hill. As they climbed the hill, taking the fire from Patriot forces, General Howe was in the back following there, and he had a servant man carrying a silver tray with wine on it, and Howe was watching the battle, drinking wine, continuing up the hill with his soldiers, and that's a bloody battle. If you know, the British side on Bunker Hill is very bloody. So Howe watched dozens and up to over hundreds of British soldiers wounded and killed in action at Bunker Hill. So Howe realizes these Americans,
Including his servant.
including his servant, his servant carrying the wine tray, wasn't killed in that battle. So Howe realizes, I don't want to take casualties. I don't want my troops to die here. He was a man that was sent. He was ordered to subdue the Americans. He was not necessarily a staunch monarchist that said, I hate George Washington, I hate all these colonials, I'm going to crush them. He's here on orders. The king asked me to do this, I'm here to do this, I'm not going to lose my men. So he did not want to see more British soldiers die. So his first thought is, okay, I can't attack the Americans straight on. Attacking didn't work. These silly militia managed to get something together and stop us here, so I don't want to attack them head on. But if you know Boston, there's a lot of water around Boston. And he realizes, my brother, the Admiral, is out here in the bay. We're going to start flanking and moving and using boats and small boats and rowboats, and the Navy itself is going to move the British Army wherever I want it to go to make sure I never have to face an American assault head on. And so that actually brings Howe to Staten Island. And Staten Island is where all the British units in America at this time are gathered on Staten Island. 32,000 British soldiers with 6,000 Hessian German soldiers as well. So that's a total of 38,000 soldiers prepared to invade the city of New York in 1776. And this also is the largest contingent ever collected by George Washington during the war as well. George Washington knows this is a massive British fleet, and he's collecting as many militiamen as he can. He's calling a Continental Congress that's brand new. Again, they just signed the Declaration in 76. And he's saying, I need men, I need militia, I need everything. And people come. He calls and people come. The Connecticut militia, the New Jersey militia, the Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, a lot of militia are coming down from the New York Highlands. This is where the roads coming down the New York Highlands are very important, as militia are coming down from there as well. And George Washington himself gathers a 32,000-man army on Long Island, between Long Island and Manhattan in 1776, waiting for the 38,000 British troops to come upon the beaches there. I was going to turn back over to Cadet Manetti for a second to tell us about the Hessians, because the Hessians are a very important part of the Battle of White Plains, along as these early campaigns. So remind us who these Hessians are.
Yeah, so the Hessians are named Hessians, but they don't all come from the same area in Germany. The vast majority of them are rented from King George's. One of King George's relatives is the Prince of Hesse-Kassel, which is this combined province of what we now call Germany. At the time, Germany's just made up of a bunch of different provinces, princedoms, fiefdoms, and there's a long tradition in German military history going all the way back to the Middle Ages, German princes renting out their soldiers to the highest bidders. And it's no different during the Revolutionary War. King George calls up the Prince of Hesse-Kassel, Prince of Brunswick, and a bunch of other princedoms, and he says, hey, can I borrow your armies? And they say, sure. You'll pay us 10 pounds per Hessian soldier that we send. And in doing so, he collects about 6,000 Hessians who are shipped from all over German princely states to Portsmouth. They board British ships. They're largely given British equipment and shipped down to Staten Island to join the British invasion force. Now, politically, this was not a great move for King George in terms of reconciling the Americans to him, because by bringing mercenaries into this war, because that's how the Americans view these Hessian soldiers, these German hired soldiers, they view them as mercenaries. King George is saying, essentially, this is no longer a civil conflict, a conflict between people of the same family. This is a rebellion, and the king is going to crush this rebellion in the same way that they crushed rebellions in Scotland and Ireland for pretty much the first half of the 18th century. And so when the Americans see the Hessians show up in New York in July and early August of 1776, they've realized the conflict of the war has changed, or the character of the war has changed at this point. It's no longer this nice civil conflict where we can write a letter to King George and say, hey, sorry we killed all your guys at Bunker Hill. Do you want to work things out? This is going to be winner take all. If we lose, people are going to be executed type of deal. So it's very intimidating for the Americans, and it also really enrages them as well.
Yeah, these Hessian troops do change the feature of the war. Again, Hessian troops are known for no quarter. They're known for violence. They're known to be shock troops. So if British Grenadiers are already tough shock troops, now you add on these Hessian shock troops, the Americans are like, I don't know how we're going to do this. Old George Washington, you're going to pull us together here. What are we going to do? This picture I have up here is actually from an Osprey publishing book. They're a publishing company that works specifically on military history. And this is actually depicting the Battle of White Plains when von Wassenberger's Fusiliers crossed the Bronx River, which I'll come to specifically in the Battle of White Plains. But it's a fantastic image because it shows their uniforms very accurately, and they're holding up their cartridge boxes with powder to keep their powder out of the river and out of the flames, because there's a wildfire burning from the conflict. But I'll come back to this battle exactly. I just wanted you to be able to picture Hessians, knowing that these are tough shock troops the American colonials are not fond of.
Two other things I'll say about the Hessians. Compared to the British soldiers, Hessians are drafted by their princes. So whenever the princes decide to rent out their armies, they go and they essentially impress all of the farmers who live on their farm or are tenants on their lord's farms. And they say, hey, congratulations, you're a soldier now, you're going to America. And this creates a problem within the Hessian ranks that you'll see throughout the war, where as soon as they get to America and they realize, if I desert, life is going to be a lot better than if I'm being killed so that my prince can get 10, or he's paid an additional 10 pounds if they're killed, so he's making money if they die. So they realize, rather than dying so that my prince can make money, if I run away, I'm going to have a lot better life in America. And so desertion becomes a very, very big problem for the Hessian soldiers as they go through the war, especially because he doesn't want to risk his British soldiers, often uses his Hessian soldiers essentially either as a diversionary force for the Americans to shoot at, or when he knows that his forces are going to take a number of casualties storming a position, they send the soldiers that they don't really care about to do that sort of dirty work.
Hessians dying in America. I guess they don't want to die here, but they're going to die a lot. So we'll get there. Back to this massive invasion fleet. Remember, there's 38,000 British troops on Staten Island, 32,000 American troops between Long Island and Manhattan. And George Washington really wants to defend New York. He wants to show we can do this. He wants to show the Continentals have the strength, that our rebellion is not something that's going to be snuffed out. Because again, the British Empire is very used to snuffing out rebellions. This is not their first rebellion they've dealt with. And they, as Cadet Minetti mentioned, they often put down rebellions very, very harshly. So that's part of this, declaration, Spirit of 76 age of where they know if they lose, it's going to be a harsh defeat for them. So Washington spends a lot of time preparing the defenses of New York. Long Island itself is one of General Nathaniel Greene's first main projects under Washington. He spends weeks building up the defenses of Long Island. Washington himself spends weeks building up what's called the Brooklyn Heights, the Manhattan fortifications. They build 5 forts on Manhattan itself. They build Fort Lee, Fort Washington farther up the Hudson. And they even early prepare defenses at Harlem in case it gets to that point, because they know the British Navy is the British Navy. The British Navy is the number one thing that the Howe brothers have in their pocket to threaten the Americans. So New York, Manhattan, a peninsula, all surrounded by water, is very difficult to defend. And Washington had this great moment maybe when the siege of Boston is a victory. The British retreat down the hill. He's fortified Dorchester Heights. He's had the victory at Bunker Hill. Everything went well. So he's like, I have to recreate this again, because this is the greatest empire on earth at this time. How do I defeat this largest military on earth? George Washington, not in some respects, not the best military commander of the age yet. He's a young officer, hasn't fought as much as we think he maybe has fought, and so he's relying on his few experiences where things worked out. And that's in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. He built a lot of roads, he went a lot of places really fast, and dug in fast. So he says, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to dig in. Dorchester Heights worked out really well. He's able to draw siege lines, bring up the cannon, the famous Henry Knox moment, where Henry Knox brings cannons down to Boston. So Washington says, how can I recreate this? build good defenses, make the empire attack me, and we will be able to win. So they establish a position on what's called Gowanus Heights. This is kind of right in the middle of modern day Brooklyn in a lot of ways. And Gowanus Heights is this to us now, again, this is all built up. The maps going around, you can probably tell, is an ancient world. This ancient world is very hard to pull out of the New York cityscape these days. But the Gowanus Heights are a set of high ground coming up from Jamaica Bay. And George Washington has notoriously bad intelligence at this time. He has no idea what the British are really going to do. He just knows there's a bunch of them and they're on Staten Island. He thinks they're probably coming from Manhattan, but they could come from Long Island. And that's why General Nathaniel Greene, one of his trusted generals, even this early stages of the war, is down there on Long Island. And Washington does make many tours touring Long Island at this time as well. But he doesn't know where the British are going to go. Then there's this very famous moment where the largest invasion fleet in the history of the world sets sail from Staten Island, and people don't know where they're going to land. And this largest invasion fleet in the history of the world was not surpassed until D-Day in World War II. So this is a big British fleet. These, again, 38,000 British soldiers at once at sea, prepared to land on Long Island, and George Washington does not know that that's where they're going. So they do make a landing at Jamaica Bay. And this, each day, thousands of soldiers are coming ashore. It takes them weeks to build up their position there south of Gowanus Heights. This is the lower end of Long Island. And they're going to push up over the heights. So George Washington's like, okay, we got this. We're dug in at Brooklyn. We're dug in on the heights. We have our best regiments of Glovers, Maryland Marbleheaders. We have the Delaware Regulars, fantastic regiments in George Washington's eyes that are going to hold the heights, no problem. But two bad things happen. General Nathaniel Greene, fantastic general, brilliant scholar, studying his best to become a military leader, falls very sick. The troops don't have the discipline that British soldiers have. They don't have the organized camps. They don't have the organized food. They don't have logistic networks yet. A lot of troops are sick. General Nathaniel Greene becomes one of them. He gets very sick and is not able to support the defense of Long Island as these thousands of British soldiers are coming ashore at Jamaica Bay. And the second thing is Howe says, I'm not going to lose my British soldiers. They're going to flank. I'm going to use boats, and they're going to flank. And so, using loyalists and other spies in the region, Howe moves a large force all the way east up Long Island, and they come up the Jamaica Pass to come around the defenses that George Washington had established. And the Hessians, this is where they first come in, are charged right up the hill. General Howe, as much as he wants to save his own soldiers, is not worried about the Hessians. Charges the Hessians up into the face of the American positions on Gowanus Heights. This is again center of Long Island, Gowanus Heights. The Americans engage with them and then are stunned by a flanking position that comes along the Jamaica Pass, and they completely retreat. And this is where the very famous stand of the Maryland 400 comes in along the Gowanus Creek. They largely sacrifice their position to allow the rest of the army to retreat up into the Brooklyn Heights position. So Long Island quickly falls, and George Washington only has the Brooklyn Heights. Brooklyn Heights are a strong point, though. Very, very strong defenses. They've spent weeks and months building. He has Manhattan defenses. George Washington still feels good, but he realizes the boats are a problem. Because at this time, there's two British boats, the HMS Phoenix and the HMS Rose, that are strong frigates that have gone up and down the Hudson, essentially taunting George Washington, showing him it doesn't matter what he does, the British are coming for you. And so this HMS Phoenix, HMS Rose attack and harry multiple spots up beyond Manhattan, all the way up to Kingsbridge at the north end of the island. And so George Washington's getting a little nervous. This is where the famous, in the words of some historians, providential retreat happens from Brooklyn to Kips Bay in a foggy day, stormy day. The American army retreats to Manhattan. And this begins a series of retreats where George Washington knows, I can't face the British army head on, I gotta find a better position. He's falling back to Manhattan, falling back to Harlem Heights. And the British are coming, they're surrounding, boats on either side. There's a dramatic Hessian British landing at Frog's Neck, and then again at Pell's Point. They're all trying to come up, and this is where the Bronx River comes in. So Manhattan is falling. Manhattan falls to the British forces. George Washington doesn't know where to go. He has to get out of Harlem Heights because he realizes he can't hold that. They're going to flank him one way or another, either the East River or the Long Island Sound. They're coming for him, so he has to move again. And that's where he moves to the Bronx River, this inner passage that leads north. And George Washington bushwhacks a road. There had not previously been a road on the west side of the Brooklyn River action reports. This is kind of this captain's edition of an after-action report in 1776. So the battle's happened, everything's gone on. He puts the Hessians went here, the British went here, the British went here, the Hessians went here. So you see positions everywhere. But note these positions were an advancement of British forces, but he does have the rebels in his mind. The dirty rebels are here on this hill, and there's a little bridge here, and this is the very famous artillery duel between Alexander Hamilton's big 2-gun battery against many British guns going back and forth here. So we have an artillery duel over a small bridge of the Bronx here. And on this southern/western side here, we have the Hessians. And the Hessians are ordered by General Howe again, to go right into the American guns and charge the hill. So British are having an artillery duel, and the Hessians are flanking. And this is where the Hessians are criticized very heavily for not crossing the river fast enough. General Howe actually sends officers over to criticize them of disobeying his orders, when really they were avoiding a fire. All these cannonballs and fires, different things have going on. There's a brush fire, because this Bronx River, the beautiful revitalized Bronx River that we're kind of picturing of trees and bushes, this is all cut down. This is farmland. This is very clear-cut farmland. There are very few trees in the area. If there are trees, they're an orchard. And so again, soldiers like Joseph Paul Martin write about stealing from all these orchards because they're just very hungry here. So they're taking a lot of orchards, not a lot of trees. So these brush fires are a problem, and you're just stuck in smoke and fire. And if you're shooting muskets and cannons, it's just a very hazy, smoky, fire-filled region here. And the Hessians do end up making 3 assaults on Chatterton Hill here. Let me see if my next map works. Okay, cool. So this is Chatterton Hill. Right here, and we have McDougall's forces. Again, this is the famous Glover Marblehead men are in there, as well as the regiments of Delaware. Some of Washington's best troops are on Chatterton Hill. And this forward position, to our eyes, maybe looks super far out there. How are they going to connect? But Washington knew if the British take this hill, his position starts to fall apart. He's very aware of cannon ranges and cannon fires, so the American forces needed to hold Chatterton Hill to prevent the British bombarding their further on position, which is largely between the Purdy House all the way over to Silver Lake. Is kind of the main American line, and so the Chatterton position is a little bit in front of this American line. This map here does a good job of showing the heavy British pressure here, but it is all German. Heister, Leslie, von Rahl, Birch, these are all German names, and German Hessians putting a lot of pressure on the Americans, and they go through 3 assaults. 3 assaults of the Hessians attacking the hill, and it's only on the 3rd one that the American, very newly put together units do break and fall back, and they fall back to that first American line. And this Chatterton Hill is a really important moment because the Hessians take heavy casualties. We're not going to see the Hessians used in this large of a force again for a while, because Howe has to wait for more German reinforcements. He's lost so many Hessians in these engagements here. But there's a famous moment during the artillery duels that are again going on with the bridge over here as the British continue to move up, where again Joseph Paul Martin writes, anytime in the Revolution, Kidamani knows this, if something extremely grotesque happens, a leg being taken off, a head being taken off, everyone writes it down. All the captains and soldiers write it down. And so there's some very violent things that happen in this battle that Joseph Paul Martin writes down, because again, they're shocked by this our huge artillery bombardment where the British are just pounding the hillside, leading to many American deaths. Chatterton Hill. As we move up from Chatterton Hill, the battle goes farther north. And this first American line, again, really connecting from the Purdy and Miller House over to Purdy House, actually a little bit farther up here. This line goes all up to Silver Lake at the very top of the hill there, top of the map, excuse me. So the Americans are trying to dig in again. They're trying to show you can't keep assaulting us, and if you do assault us, you're going to pay for it. And the British know this because the Hessians have paid for it. So the Hessians are already kind of out of the fight. Howe's army is very hesitant to attack here. But this is kind of the culmination of all the movements and all the flankings and the game of chess back and forth between Washington and Howe. And Howe kind of throws in the towel. He reaches the American first line here, probes them a little bit, causing them to fall back to their second line, which is up to, oh, come on, Matt, there we go, up to the Miller House. So that's the second American line, and this is just by probes. The British Army comes up, probes the first line, and the Americans give up. The Americans say, we're not ready to fight here, we're going to fall back to our second line, and we want to fight you the second line. And Howe says, no thanks. And Howe does not attack, and he actually returns south to New York City on November 5th. So this battle began October 28th with the assault on Chatterton Hill and ends November 5th when Howe just leaves. He goes back south, but there's something south he knows he needs to take, which is Fort Lee and Fort Washington. They're a thorn in the side. He's kind of letting Washington have White Plains. And if he lets Washington have White Plains, this sets up, as Mr. DeVillo told us, the neutral ground, or the no man's land. I want Cadet Minetti to kind of tell you about why this no man's land is significant and kind of where the boundaries of this no man's land are as Howe retreats south and Washington is kind of left holding White Plains. Well, he does withdraw as well. This is again kind of considered a neutral battle here. Washington ends up withdrawing. So go ahead.
Sure. So the Battle of White Plains ends in a very inconclusive draw. One could say Washington and Howe both withdraw from the field. Howe withdraws down to throw the Hessians, again actually, at Fort Washington and Fort Lee, and the Hessians do take Fort Washington and Lee. So the British then, by the end of this is a very famous moment from the Battle of Fort Washington, where the original Molly pitcher, back before the Battle of Monmouth, the Molly pitcher we all learned about in school, this is the original Margaret Corbett, the wife of an American artilleryman, who is killed defending Fort Washington, takes over his position on the gun, and is actually shot and wounded by the Hessians as they storm over the works of Fort Washington. The Americans lose 3,000 of their best men and much of their stores of winter clothing and ammunition and weapons in these defeats of Fort Washington and Lee. And so that sets George Washington up for his ragtag march through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, that ends with battles at Trenton and Princeton that sort of revitalized the Revolution. But while all this is going on, there's still an American force to the north, and there's a British force to the south. And they sort of look at each other and they go, we don't really want to fight each other because there's no real good way to get at each other. The Bronx River actually does a very good job of setting up terrain in such a way that there's no real good way to move a large force either north or south other than the Hudson River. And as you can see from the terrain in the background here at Fort Washington, as you go further up the Hudson River, the terrain only gets worse and for landings and such. And the British attempt landings, but they aren't able to use their navy to effectively land troops in force. So what that does is this creates this very awkward situation where the American lines stabilize around Cortlandt Manor or so over Plunk's Point, the ferries up there, and the British lines stabilize around Kingsbridge at the top of Manhattan Island, right around the mouth of the Bronx River, Spuyten Duyvil, that area. And for the remainder of the war, from November, December 1776, all the way to 1783, Westchester County becomes a wasteland. Think almost like World War I. There are raids back and forth. The Cowboys and the Skinners, as you touched on earlier. The Skinners also, an alternate explanation for their name is they were known for robbing highway travelers, people who were brave enough to travel the roads between New York and Connecticut, going through Westchester County. And these men at gunpoint would rob their victims to their skins. They would leave these people butt naked sometimes in the harsh New York winters. And while there were certain organized units like Delancey's Rangers or Beverly Robinson's militia as well. Beverly Robinson's a little further up the Hudson River, but he actually marries into the Phillips family and so bases a lot of his raiding operations in Westchester County. So there are some organized units, but by and large, a lot of these units during this time are just local bandits. They're partisans. Going into 1780, 1781, looking at Andre's capture, the trial and capture of Major Andre, he's apprehended by these three, they're called in some sources militia from Tarrytown, but Benjamin Talmadge, Washington's chief of intelligence, who has a lot of interactions with Andre, and has a lot of interactions with these three men who capture him, later when he's a senator in the 1800s, and these three men are petitioning for an increase in the pension that they were awarded for capturing Andre. They go and they write in the 1800s to Congress and they say, hey, can you give us some more money? And Talmadge goes on a rant for an hour and a half on the Senate floor about how these men were nothing more than common criminals who turned Andre into the Americans because they thought they would get a better reward than if they brought Andre to the British lines. And so it's not uncommon to see that these cowboys and these Skinners oftentimes flip-flop back and forth, just wherever they can make a quick buck, whoever's going to give them the most money, that's who they're going to go with. Now, in addition to these irregular forces that you see sort of raiding back and forth through Westchester County, you see regular forces as well, forces of mainly cavalry. This is one of the few areas in the Revolutionary War where cavalry, dragoon formations, people on horseback become very important because you need to cross this vast area pretty quickly. And so what you'll see is Americans raid down toward the British lines at Kings Bridge, and the British, in return, will raid up toward the American lines at Cortlandt Manor. And that leads to a number of very bloody, very no quarter taken, not well remembered, small skirmishes. It's sort of almost guerrilla warfare that occurs in Westchester County. You may be familiar, you drive to work or whatever, and you'll see these plaques on the side of the road, but for these very small fights, like Edgar's Lane, Young's Corner. This is actually very good American Revolutionary War artist, Don Triani. And he painted, a few years back, a picture of Edgar's Lane, which is this very small ambush by Virginia and Connecticut dragoons of a Hessian patrol going along the post road from New York up toward to probe the American lines at to probe the American lines, and so they actually wipe out that Hessian patrol, and in response, the Hessians then raid a Continental Dragoon camp at Young's Tavern and wipe that camp out. And that's sort of how the war goes, back and forth. No prisoners taken. Anybody who can afford to flee, civilians, do leave the area. They say, okay, we're gone. But those who can't afford to leave, or those who have a significant stake in staying and holding their property, such as the Van Tassel family or the Cortlandt family, do in fact try to stay and hold on as best they can throughout the war. And after the war, a lot of tall tales and legends and stories grow up out of their experiences in this no man's land between the forces. So you get some of the seed for a lot of these legends and these stories, especially Washington Irving's stuff that's coming out later after the Revolution. A lot of the seed material for that is these sort of nameless, bloody engagements from the war that really sort of stick in the psyche of the population that stays in Westchester County during the conflict. One of the most famous examples of this is the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, where the headless Hessian, Washington Irving writes, was beheaded in some nameless battle of the Revolution. A very early ghost story coming out of this area is that the Van Tassel family farm was burned in the winter of 1777, and the Hessians actually rescued the matriarch of the family, Elizabeth Van Tassel, from that fire that was consuming her house, along with her baby. And so in this spring of 1778, when they were out sort of trying to rebuild everything, they came across a Hessian who had been beheaded in one of these little skirmishes, and they paid for his burial. And so the legend then grew up that among the tenant farmers who were working the land, that there was this headless phantom wandering around looking for his head at night. And so it's these sort of stories born out of the trauma of the war in this period that provide a lot of these really colorful illustrations that really grow up this rich folklore tradition in the Hudson Valley following the war. Sir, I'll turn it back over to you if you've got any final points that you'd like to add.
Yeah, I just want to kind of summarize where we're at from everything we've covered, and to highlight what Cadet Minetti was saying about this no man's land. I just want to help you kind of picture of that if the British garrison is in New York City, and the New York City garrison is able to reach up beyond Kingsbridge pretty well, but that's about it. So the British are staying kind of Kingsbridge and south, essentially contained to Manhattan Island in many ways. But the Americans, they have a little bit more freedom of maneuver. They do have the West Point, which at this time is Fort Clinton, and then there's just south of that, Fort Montgomery, which is challenged in 77. There's some dramatic stories about that. But the American lines kind of have a general line from that kind of Peekskill, Stony Point, Fort Montgomery region is where the American army is remaining, while the British army is down south. So that leaves quite a big swath of land for this no man's land that we've just described. So at the end of the war, that no man's land is there after Washington has retreated across Long Island through Manhattan, using the Bronx River to move up north, that kind of bushwhack path, because again, that was an inner passage where he was able to hide from the British Navy in the Hudson and the British Navy in Long Island Sound. and able to begin building positions, hopefully to stop the British. And there, even if you look at these maps very closely, there's a bunch of little American positions marked out all along the Bronx River where they would camp for the night or stop for the night or patrol, hoping to stop any British attempts to cross the Bronx River without the Americans knowing. So again, this Battle of White Plains and the Bronx River is a kind of important final chapter in that overall 1776 campaign, which was the largest American army of the Revolutionary War and the largest British army of the Revolutionary War, both coming to a head from August 1776 through November 1776. I think I'll stop there so we can have some conversation and more questions for Mr. DeVillo and myself and Cadet Menettis. If you want more explanation of these maps, I'm happy to talk more about these, or if we have other battle questions, well, we can head for whatever.
Right, I think we've got a question right down in the front.
Right, I think you want to post that.
I'll pass around the mic, and if you guys want to share one mic to answer.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yes, I do. I've heard rumors, and I was wondering, Captain, if you had any thoughts on it, that when Howe got above White Plains or at White Plains by the bridge, you had stormy weather and a lot of rain, and you can't fire muskets in the rain. And the river was higher then and flowing faster, and it would be rough to get equipment across. And he also, this is a little interesting, he supposedly had an American loyalist girlfriend. And when he got above White Plains, he said, "Washington isn't here. I want to get back to my girlfriend." And so that's why he stopped fighting, because if he really wanted to get Washington with his superior forces and whatever was left of the Hessians, he could have. I mean, he wasn't so against the Americans, okay, but he wanted to get back to his girlfriend. And the last part of my question was, didn't they try to court-martial him back in England, or something to that effect?
Yeah, I kind of feel like there's three points to that question. So first one about the river, I'll cover that. I'll let Cadet Minetti talk about the girlfriend, because you're not wrong. That is definitely an element. And your third point there of court-martial, I don't recall Howe being court-martialed.
He's censured. He's censured when he goes back to England. Yeah.
They kind of complain and judge him, say, "Oh, you didn't do everything." But I don't think there was a formal court-martial.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Okay, yeah. So a parliamentary inquiry. Yeah, that's the correct terminology. And the river, you're exactly right. Back to the picture of the Hessians crossing the river, that was their kind of complaint of like, we can't find a ford. The British are hogging the one ford over by the bridge. We don't want to drown. The river was kind of rising and falling. This is again October, November. So the weather is very fickle in October and November, as we all know. So yes, the river is rising and falling. The Hessians complain in their writings and journals about crossing the river, and again the British judge them and mock them of saying, we crossed the river faster than you, we're better soldiers. And the Hessians are like, no, we crossed the river and stormed the hill. So there's this soldierly bickering back and forth. Tell us about the girlfriend.
Sure, yeah, so there are a couple things to note about General Howe. First is that there are actually three Howe brothers originally. There's Richard, who becomes an admiral in the Navy. There's William, who's the commander of the land forces during the Revolution. And then there's their older brother, George. Now, George is very, very interesting because he fights in the French and Indian War, which is the war which precedes the Revolution. And it's this big conflict between the British and the French, and the Prussians and the Austrians get involved. And the important part here is it's fought in America for control of North America between the British and the French. Now, George Howe is killed at upstate fighting at the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga in 1758, then called Fort Carillon. And the Americans so loved and respected George Howe that they built a monument to him. And William, a younger British officer fighting at the same time, sort of came to not necessarily love the Americans, but not necessarily despise them either. And so on the eve of the Revolution, he's actually arguing for a conciliatory policy toward the Americans in Parliament. So there were a number of suspicions that he harbored sympathies toward the Americans during the war, and that was actually what the inquiry in Parliament was about. And so I think sort of his Whiggish sympathies combined with, he was seeing, there's ample evidence to support the assertion that he's seeing the wife of his loyalist commissary officer, Henry Loring, back in New York City, and they have a whole dalliance throughout the winter of 1776. And when Washington wins at Trenton, he can't even be bothered to rouse himself from New York. He's like, hey, one of you other generals, please go deal with this. I'm having fun with Mrs. Loring right now. Don't just leave me alone. Let me do my thing. And that becomes sort of one of the major criticisms of him is he spends too much time with Mrs. Loring and not enough time winning the war.
Thank you.
Yeah, and as even before White Plains, when the retreat from Harlem Heights happened, that was the first time I believe she came into the story of was she helping Washington by distracting Howe as he escaped from Harlem. So yeah, she is a player in this 1776 year.
Hi, my question is for the board in general, and I was just wondering, based on your expertise in this, I had a curiosity come up from the brief that we're doing, particularly with the Battle of White Plains, and it relates to, George Washington is defending New York City, obviously, for its importance of population and ports and, and prestige and so forth. He's losing, and there's a series of retreats. In your opinions, and as well, there may not be a correct answer for this, is his retreat more of what we would modern call like defense in depth, that is designed to use a series of successive defenses and successive prepared positions in order to encourage this defense to last longer and not lose decisively? Or is it more just kind of like he's getting his butt kicked and these are all hasty defenses and he's running for his life and he sort of gets lucky, and whichever one it is, what significance would you attach to that?
You want to start?
Well, yeah, the captain will probably agree. You probably couldn't call it a defense in depth. There's more. There's not a prepared series of defenses as you would see in a modern warfare. But nevertheless, as you look at the Revolutionary War, starting with 1776, you'll see Washington developing a defensive strategy. What 1776 taught him a couple of things. That really, as much as he wanted to be Frederick the Great, but the people he had, he could not really go toe-to-toe with the British and Hessians in an open field battle. This wasn't Europe, this wasn't the Battle of Minden, it wasn't going to work, not for him. So he started to develop, a much more, what was called Fabian tactics, and he got a lot of criticism for this, but relying more on small unit action. Trenton and Princeton were classic examples, and this taught him a lesson. This was going to be the key to victory. He wasn't going to beat the British outright, but he could wear them down with a lot of these small victories and keep an army in being. And 7 years later, the British are still in North America. Washington still has an army. There's still a Continental Congress. And then, Yorktown was just the last straw. They realized they were not going to win this.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that and say it's definitely not a defense in depth. It is a strong point defense, and that is the very intentional creation of the Brooklyn Heights, the Gowanus Line, the Manhattan forts, coupled with the Harlem forts, are all strong points of where could the British come. If they come here or here, 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 we're going to hopefully stop them. That all crumbles due to experience and flanking and all sorts of things. But there's even, to your point of defense in depth, there's a temper Washington tries to sell. It is a defense in depth, and that's after, as they're about to leave Harlem Heights, he realizes if he says again, we're retreating again, the militia are going to just break. Everyone's going to abandon him. And so he conveniently says, we have to relocate. This is the part of the plan. We're relocating to a better position. We planned for this, AKA we're now going to bushwhack to White Plains. But he had to sell that as he was a prepared defense in depth when it was not at that time. It was definitely a strong point defense. One quick thought.
Yeah, and the other important thing to note is he doesn't actually want to defend New York in the first place. The whole New York campaign is not necessarily his idea, it's the Continental Congress's idea. And if you read his journals throughout the campaign, he's like, why am I even here? Why did just get Congress up here and show them the British fleet and show them the hopelessness of this position. So he's very frustrated in doing this, and he's really just he has no intelligence network at this point. The one spy he sends to New York, September of '76, Nathan Hale, it just ends in absolute disaster, and so he's running blind and basically just trying to do the best he can with what Congress tells him to do.
I just have a quick technical question about the river itself. How deep is the river near White Plains, and how deep is it down in the Bronx, near the zoo in that area?
Well, there's a lot of debate about this because it's believed the Bronx River may have been deeper before they built the Kensico Dam and cut off its headwaters. Perhaps, but a lot of this is guesswork. It may have been maybe 25% more volume of water. But the catch is, even though it's very shallow up here in White Plains, you really can't get a canoe through town most of the time. But the Bronx River is known as a flashy river. It's the environmental term for it. It's in a very narrow rocky valley. And I'm sure anybody who's driven the Parkway will back me up on this. You get any precipitation event at all, the river very quickly rises. It's very quick to flood, as you know from if you live around Bronxville. And it goes down quickly too, but that's very little consolation. Now, the last week of October, 1776, it had been, from what I can gather, a very wet autumn. And on the day of the Chatterton Hill battle, there was a ford right at the very southern tip of Chatterton Hill. The railroad tracks are on the site now. But at the time, the ford, which probably would have been knee deep, maybe thigh deep, you could wade across it, it was chest high. And remember, this is the end of October. You don't want to be going for a dip in the Bronx River. I've done it. I don't recommend it.